The chapel was nothing like the grand cathedrals people imagine when thinking of a wedding. It stood quietly on the outskirts of a small town in Vermont, an old wooden church that seemed to bend slightly with the weight of time and weather. But to Emily Parker, it was perfect. She had passed that church every day growing up, watching as seasons painted it in amber, white, and green. She never imagined she would be walking through its doors as a bride, especially not under such scrutiny. As the clock struck 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the guests inside the church rose to their feet. The first chords of a simple piano melody filled the space. All eyes turned to the entrance. Then, silence. Not the reverent silence of admiration, but a stillness heavy with judgment. Emily stood at the threshold, her hands trembling slightly around a bouquet of wildflowers she had picked herself that morning. Her dress hand-sewn modest, with uneven stitching in some places and delicate fabric that shimmered faintly under the sun, told a different story from designer gowns many expected. She had no lace veil cascading down her back, no rhinestones or custom tailoring. Instead, her gown clung softly to her figure, natural and unpolished, almost childlike in its simplicity. The murmur started almost immediately. "Is that the dress? She really walked in with that? It looks like something from a thrift store." Aunt Marlene, Nathan's father's sister, whispered loudly enough for half the pew to hear. "Looks like she couldn't afford a real wedding gown." Her lips curled in a smile that didn't bother to hide its contempt. Emily heard everything. Though the piano played on and the officiant smiled kindly at her from the altar, her ears seemed tuned only to the sounds of ridicule. She didn't glance sideways, didn't meet the eyes of the guests, many of whom came from Nathan's side. She held her gaze forward, straight at the man who stood waiting for her. Nathan Miller. He was tall, well-dressed in a simple black suit that, despite its elegance, seemed to match her tone rather than upstage it. His eyes, blue, sincere, and unwavering, locked with hers the moment she stepped inside. And when he smiled, it was not the forced smile of social politeness, but one of pride, one that said, "You're everything I hope you'd be." Still, the tension in the room was unmistakable. Emily's father walked beside her, his arm steady, though he avoided eye contact with most of the guests. He had heard the whispers, too. Her mother, sitting in the front row, had tears in her eyes, not of sadness, but of quiet worry, knowing how much Emily had poured into that dress, and how much the moment meant to her. The aisle, though only a few steps long, felt like a marathon. Every glance stung. Every half-smile or raised brow felt like a slap. And yet, Emily walked on, refusing to let shame take her. Deep inside, she knew the truth about the dress. She knew what it represented. But no one else did, or so she thought. When she finally reached the altar, Nathan reached for her hand. His touch was warm, grounding. For a brief second, she allowed herself to breathe. Then came surprise. Instead of turning toward the officiant, Nathan turned to face the congregation. The room shifted. People adjusted in their seats, expecting a joke or perhaps a light-hearted remark. Instead, Nathan cleared his throat, and silence fell over the room like a sheet of snow. "I know many of you are wondering about Emily's dress," he began, his voice calm, unwavering. "You might be thinking it's too simple, or wondering why she didn't wear something more expected." Emily looked up at him, startled. This wasn't part of the plan. They had rehearsed vows, not speeches. "But before you judge," Nathan continued, his eyes sweeping the room slowly, "you should know the story behind it. Because what Emily hasn't told you all is that this dress carries more meaning than anything you've seen in a bridal magazine." Whispers rippled to the room again, this time with a different tone. Curiosity. Confusion. Emily's fingers tightened around Nathan's. Her heart pounded. She had never told him. How could he possibly know? Nathan gave her a reassuring glance, then turned back to the guests. "I'll explain everything," he said. "But you all deserve to know who this woman really is and what this dress truly stands for." And in that moment, something shifted. The mockery turned to anticipation. The smug smiles faded. And Emily, for the first time since she walked through the doors, felt something unfamiliar wash over her. Hope. She didn't know what Nathan was going to say, but she knew him, and if he was about to tell the truth she had kept so close to her heart. Then the room was about to hear a story that none of them would forget. Before the piano ever played, before the whispers slithered between pews and the first stitch of that dress had been sewn, there was a fluorescent-lit hallway in a small community hospital where the air smelled faintly of antiseptic and determination. Emily Parker walked those corridors daily, not in heels or white gowns, but in scrubs 2 sizes too big, with her name tag crooked and hair pulled back into a bun that never quite held. Her days were long, sometimes thankless, but she loved the work because it was real. She held trembling hands of the elderly, soothed frightened children, and often skipped meals to sit with patients who had no visitors. That place was not just a job. It was a mission she had chosen long before she ever met Nathan Miller. Nathan entered her world like an unexpected draft through a sealed window, subtle at first, but impossible to ignore. He wasn't supposed to be in that hospital. He was a young lawyer, freshly graduated from Columbia, brimming with ambition and principle. But he had grown disillusioned by the corporate path most of his peers followed, and instead accepted a fellowship to provide free legal services for low-income families. He would sit in a corner office on the 3rd floor, often surrounded by paperwork, frustrated voices, and impossible deadlines. The hospital was merely one of his many outreach posts, until he met her. Their first real conversation wasn't romantic or poetic. It happened in the cafeteria, over stale coffee and a shared sigh. Emily had just lost a patient she'd grown close to. Nathan had just been yelled at by a desperate father whose case he couldn't take. She sat beside him, not a comfort, but because every other seat was taken. He offered her his last piece of banana bread, without a word. She took it with a nod. That moment, silent, tired, mutual, was the beginning of everything. In the weeks that followed, they found each other in quiet pockets of the day. Sometimes they exchanged knowing glances in the hallway. Other times they stayed after hours, talking about their work, their fears, and the constant pressure to do more with less. They never flirted in the traditional sense, but their bond was unmistakable. It was a kind of connection built not on charm or performance, but on shared purpose. He admired how she handled patients with dignity, even when she was exhausted. She respected his refusal to compromise, even when it would have been easier to turn his back. Slowly, admiration gave way to something deeper. Their relationship wasn't without tension. Nathan's background was different. He came from a family of privilege and expectation. His father had been a judge, his mother a socialite known for hosting fundraising galas. When he introduced Emily to them over dinner, the contrast was stark. Emily wore a thrifted navy dress and no makeup. She spoke softly, choosing her word with care. Nathan's mother smiled the entire night, but it never reached her eyes. His father asked pointed questions about her long-term ambitions. They didn't see her the way Nathan did. They didn't try. But Nathan didn't waver. He proposed to her on the rooftop of the hospital, on a rare night off, with a ring so simple it could have been mistaken for costume jewelry. Emily said yes without hesitation, not because of the ring or the setting or the future promised, but because in that moment, nothing else in the world felt more certain. When wedding planning began, Emily made a clear decision. She didn't want extravagance. She didn't want crystal chandeliers or imported flowers. She didn't want a planner or a venue booked a year in advance. She wanted something honest, something they could build with their own hands. Nathan supported her, though he offered to cover costs or enlist help. She declined. Every decision, from the invitations hand-lettered by her sister to the pies baked by her neighbors for dessert, was hers, not out of pride, but because she believed that love didn't need spectacle. And yet, there was one part she kept entirely to herself. Late at night, after her shifts at the hospital, Emily would sit by the window with a small basket of fabrics. They weren't bolts from craft stores or delicate silks bought online. They were remnants, donated scraps from women she had cared for. Over time, she had begun to ask if they had anything meaningful they would part with: a scarf, a piece of the blouse, a faded handkerchief. She never told them why, but one by one, they gave. Some cried when they handed the pieces over. Others simply nodded. Each scrap held a story of resilience, of loneliness, of small victories over pain. She didn't cut them to size. She worked around them, letting their shapes guide the dress's design. It took weeks, then months. She didn't rush. Every stitch was a silent prayer, not for beauty, but for remembrance. Nathan never saw the dress. She kept it hidden in a garment bag behind a false panel in her closet. She wanted it to be a surprise. But more than that, she wanted to remain hers, untouched by opinion or expectation. The days leading to the wedding were filled with tension from both families. Nathan's mother had offered to pay for a custom gown. His sister suggested a stylist. Emily thanked them politely and declined. There were murmurs. Of course. Conversation she wasn't meant to hear. But she held her ground. Nathan, as always, backed her, though even he had started to wonder about the dress she wouldn't let him see. The morning of the wedding, Emily stood alone in the small room behind the chapel. The light through the stained glass painted her skin in soft hues of rose and gold. She looked at herself in the mirror and saw not a bride from a magazine cover, but a reflection of every woman who had given her something to carry forward. She ran her fingers over the uneven stitching on her sleeve and felt a deep ache, not of doubt, but of longing. She wasn't afraid of being judged. She was afraid that the meaning would be lost on people who only knew how to measure worth in elegance. She heard the music start. She took a breath and stepped into silence. In the days that followed the wedding, people continued to speak about the ceremony with all the casual cruelty of gossip passed over coffee or whispered in the quiet of back seats. They spoke not of vows or the quiet grace of the chapel, but the dress, that baffling, plain, hand-stitched thing that seemed to provoke so much discomfort. No one quite knew how to speak of it kindly. The fabric looked mismatched, the seams uneven. Some called it a statement, others a mistake. Most simply called it strange. But none of them knew the truth. Not yet. Emily had planned to keep it that way. Long before Nathan turned to address the guests at the altar, long before any mention of her dress reached beyond the walls of that church, she had already made peace with the silence. She wasn't looking for validation or admiration. Her intention had never been to make a spectacle. If anything, she hoped her dress would pass unnoticed, its meaning hidden like a secret tucked between layers of memory and thread. The dress had been born not from inspiration, but from grief. It began one evening in the hospital when a woman named Carmen, a frequent patient whose chemotherapy treatments had stopped working, pressed a folded square of floral fabric into Emily's hand. "For when you get married," she had said, her voice raspy, her eyes glinting with the last flickers of life. "So, you remember us, we who never got to wear white." Emily hadn't known what to say. She had taken the fabric home and kept it in her drawer for months. Then came others. A blue cotton handkerchief from Mrs. Lanning, who had lost her husband during the pandemic and visited the ER weekly just to talk to someone. A corner of a worn apron from a woman who had raised 6 children alone after fleeing an abusive marriage. Emily never asked for these pieces. They were offered freely in moments of trust and quiet solidarity. What began as a collection became a commitment. Emily decided she would not wear a gown from a store, not because she couldn't afford one, but because none of them could ever hold the weight of those stories. She began assembling the dress in secret, letting the fabric guide her. She taught herself to sew properly through online videos and old books from the library. Sometimes she would cry as she stitched, her hands moving over pieces of fabric that once lived against the skin of women whose strength she carried like a second spine. She didn't tell Nathan, not because she doubted his support, but because the dress had become a private act of resistance against the expectations others place on weddings, on appearances, on what women were supposed to be on their perfect day. The more the project grew, the more it felt sacred. It was never about proving anything. It was about holding on to something real. But secrets, even beautiful ones, have a way of surfacing. A week before the wedding, while Emily was out working a night shift, Nathan had gone to her apartment to drop off something she had forgotten. Her childhood locket, which she wanted to wear during the ceremony. He knew where she kept the spare key. The apartment was dark, quiet. He stepped inside and placed the locket on the kitchen table. Then, as he turned to leave, he noticed a sliver of fabric peeking out from behind the closet panel that didn't quite close. He shouldn't have touched it. He would later tell her that. But curiosity got the better of him. He pulled back the panel and found the dress hanging there, unfinished. The hem still waiting to be folded, a needle stuck gently through a loop of thread. At first, he didn't understand what he was looking at. It wasn't white, not exactly. It was a patchwork of color and texture: linen, cotton, silk, lace, denim, even burlap in one corner. Nothing matched, and yet somehow it did. Then he saw the notes. They were folded in a small box beneath the dress. Dozens of them, some scrawled in pen, others typed on crumpled sheets. Messages of thanks, prayers, memories, regrets. Each one from the women who had given Emily their fabric. Some letters were long and detailed, others just a name and a date. Nathan sat on the floor for what felt like hours, reading each one. By the time he finished, his hands were shaking. He didn't mention what he found. Not right away. He knew Emily hadn't intended for him to see it, but the discovery stayed with him, blooming like a weight in his chest. He couldn't stop thinking about it. Not because of how beautiful the dress was, but because of what it represented. He realized with growing certainty that the dress was not just a tribute. It was a declaration of who Emily was. The kind of person who chose meaning over aesthetics, memory over spectacle. He thought about his family, about how they would see the dress, about how they would misunderstand it, maybe even mock it. He thought about the way society had taught people to expect perfection from brides, to reduce weddings to curated performances of wealth and taste. He thought about how wrong all that was, and how brave Emily had been to say nothing. That's when he made his decision. If she wasn't going to tell the story, he would. On the morning of the wedding, he rehearsed the words in his head, not in front of a mirror, not with cue cards. He let the story live inside him, trusting that when the moment came, he would know what to say. And when he stood at the altar, watching her walk toward him in the dress he had once found by accident, he knew he had been right. He had seen people smirking. He had heard the whispers. He had watched his mother's thin smile tremble with barely concealed disapproval. But none of it mattered. Not after what he knew. Not after what that dress meant. Emily had created something powerful, without telling a soul. Now it was time for the world to hear it. Nathan had never spoken in front of a large group before. Not like this. Courtrooms were different. Structured, sterile, controlled. You presented facts, not feelings. You argued logic, not love. But standing at the altar, fingers intertwined with Emily's, with rows of faces staring back at him, many of them already hardened in judgment, he realized that logic wouldn't reach these people. The truth would have to do what argument never could. It would have to move them. He didn't look at his parents when he began. He didn't glance at his sister or his cousins. Instead, he looked at Emily. Her eyes widened as she realized what was happening. She hadn't expected this. He had told her nothing, but her grip tightened slightly around his hand, not in protest, but in trust. That was all he needed. "I know this isn't how wedding ceremonies usually begin," Nathan said, his voice calm but clear, echoing slightly through the old wooden beams above. "But before we speak our vows, there's something I need to say." A rustle of fabric, a call from the back, the creak of a pew as someone shifted uncomfortably. The guests were curious now. His mother sat still, arms folded tightly across her lap, lips pressed in a line. His father, ever the judge, tilted his head slightly, waiting. The bridesmaids looked at each other. Emily stood quietly beside him, her face composed, but her shoulders tense. He knew this was a risk, but it was one worth taking. He gestured gently toward Emily's dress, pausing as he found the right words. Some of you may have looked at Emily's dress today and wondered why it looks the way it does. You might have thought it was too simple, or strange, or not quite what you expected. Some of you probably whispered things. I heard them. She did too. A few people lowered their gazes. Someone in the middle pew cleared their throat. The tension in the room was thick, almost suffocating. But what you didn't know, Nathan continued, is that this dress carries more stories than any wedding gown I've ever seen. Each piece of fabric you see here, every color, every texture, was given to Emily by someone she cared for. Women she met while working at the community hospital. Women who had little left, but still offered her something meaningful. Some of them were sick. Some of them were lonely. Some of them had no family left. But they gave her something from their lives, an apron, a scarf, a handkerchief, a piece of a dress. And she sewed those pieces together with her own hands, not for recognition, not for praise, but because she wanted to carry them with her into this moment. Silence, real silence, not awkward, not empty, but weighty, present. Nathan continued, his voice steady. She never told me about it. I found the dress by accident, and at first, I didn't understand it either. I saw scraps, bits of fabric, but then I found the notes, letters, messages. Some were just a name or a date. Others were full of stories. Stories about surviving cancer, escaping abuse, raising children alone, losing loved ones. Stories of strength, pain, resilience. And suddenly I saw the dress differently. I saw her differently. Not that I needed a reason to admire her more, but what she did, it showed me just how deep her heart runs. He looked around the room, now filled with guests who no longer met his eyes. This dress isn't about fashion. It's not about appearances. It's about memory. It's about honoring the forgotten. It's about carrying with her the lives of women who taught her something about love, sacrifice, and survival. So when you laugh at it or judge it, you're not just mocking a dress. You're mocking every woman who gave a part of herself to be here today in spirit. The air inside the chapel had changed. There were no more shifting bodies, no more suppressed smirks or stifled chuckles. Emily's mother, seated in the front row, wiped her cheek with a tissue. A bridesmaid blinked rapidly, her lower lip trembling. Nathan's sister turned her face slightly to the side, her expression unreadable. Even his father had gone still, the skepticism gone from his eyes. Emily had not moved. She stood beside him like a statue carved from something sacred. But now her eyes glistened. Tears welled, but she did not cry. Not yet. She didn't need to. Nathan's words had done what she never intended but always hoped for. He had made them see. Nathan turned back to her now, his voice softening. Emily, I don't know how you found the strength to do what you did in silence. But I do know this. There's more grace, more dignity, and more love stitched into this dress than any silk gown could ever hold. And I am proud, not just to marry you, but to stand beside you and say to everyone here, this woman is extraordinary, and they should be so lucky to witness even a fraction of who you are. Emily's tears finally fell, silent and slow. The officiant, who had remained quiet during the speech, gave a small, almost reverent nod before speaking. Shall we proceed with the vows? Nathan and Emily turned toward each other. The ceremony continued, now transformed. The words of love and commitment were the same as they had practiced, but something in the room had shifted irrevocably. No longer was it just a wedding. It had become a moment of collective reflection, of quiet reckoning. Guests who had once smirked now sat straighter. A few dabbed at their eyes. Even those who didn't understand the full weight of what Nathan had said could feel that something profound had occurred. When they kissed, there was no roar of applause, no cheering. Just a quiet, long moment of stillness, as if the room itself was holding its breath, honoring the gravity of what had been shared. As they walked back down the aisle, hand in hand, the same eyes that judged Emily on her entrance now followed her with a different gaze. Humbled, thoughtful, changed. No one laughed. No one whispered. And as they stepped into the sunlight, the doors closing behind them, Emily exhaled for the first time in hours. She turned to Nathan and with a voice choked by gratitude, whispered, "You didn't have to do that." He smiled. "I know," he said, "but I couldn't let them walk away not knowing who they were really looking at." As the days unfolded following the wedding, what had been a quiet, intimate ceremony nestled in a Vermont chapel exploded into a public story that resonated far beyond the couple's small town. A single video clip, captured by Nathan's cousin's phone during his altar speech, circulated quickly through social media. The title scrolling beneath the thumbnail read, "Groom stops wedding to reveal secret of simple dress." It racked up thousands of views overnight, drawing tears, admiration, and awe from strangers across the country. Emily watched the views climb as she sat on her couch the next morning, coffee in hand, the light from her laptop screen reflecting in her eyes. Comments poured in, "This is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. Why aren't more weddings like this?" That dress, its meaning brought me to tears. News outlets began picking up the story, not for celebrity appeal, not for glamour, but for the raw, human truth at its core. Papers headlined it under sections labeled heartwarming, human interest, even national inspiration. Viewers across the nation were captivated not by the clothes, but by the heart stitched into them. The first to reach out was a local reporter from Vermont today, sending a polite email requesting an interview. Within hours, Emily agreed, exhausted but moved by the kindness fueling the coverage. The interview was modest, filmed in the same wooden chapel where they were married, with light filtering gently through stained glass. Emily spoke of hospital nights spent with patients, of scraps of fabric and letters folded in boxes, of wanting to carry stories forward rather than disappear into dust. Her voice trembled a bit, not from fear, but from the honest weight of emotion. The clip, posted by the station, added fuel to the fire of public fascination. Then came emails from people she'd never met, women who had lost loved ones, survivors of illness, caretakers, each writing with gratitude and identification. One woman wrote, "That dress is my story too. I didn't know how to say it. Thank you." Another shared how she had kept a quilt made from her sister's clothes after she passed. I understand now what Emily meant. The words were handwritten, typed in shaky scrawl. It didn't matter. Emily absorbed each one quietly, stunned by how deeply a simple garment could reach into people's lives. And then the hospital came calling, not with criticism, but with possibility. The director of community relations, who had watched the video, approached Emily with a proposal. What had been a heartfelt private act could become something healing, even transformational. Would she consider helping to launch a project? A living tapestry of stories across the hospital's halls? Patients and staff could contribute fabric pieces and notes, creating a mural of shared human experience that could remind everyone who passed its message. We are seen. We are remembered. Nathan, present in the meeting, watched Emily's face as the director outlined the idea. Her eyes had a light, an ember of hope. She agreed. The project, they decided, would begin in the hospital lobby, where visitors, staff, and patients could stop by a designated board, pin their own fabric scrap and note, and share their voices. Over time, it would grow, stitches and words layering into a collective portrait of healing and empathy. Local businesses offered to donate materials. A small thread shop in Burlington sent embroidery supplies. A nearby quilting guild wrote that they would help sew the pieces together into a coordinated display. Donations came in quietly, sensitively, often with small notes attached, in memory of or for all who need to be seen. Emily spent evenings sorting scraps, reading stories, labeling each with care. By late spring, the project had become more than a hospital installation. The Vermont Gazette ran a feature titled, "When a Wedding Dress Became a Movement." The story described how, because of Emily's dress and Nathan's speech, a community was weaving itself together in empathy and recognition. The display in the lobby, a quilt-like tapestry of color, memory, and text, had already become a gathering point where visitors stopped, touched, and read. Some wept, some whispered to themselves, some added their own small piece for others to read later. Then invitations came from beyond the state. A nonprofit focused on hospital humanization requested permission to feature the project in other hospitals. Emily and Nathan traveled to several community centers, explaining the idea, showing how a simple board could bloom into a collective embrace. Hospitals in other regions signed up, in Oregon, Michigan, Texas. Emily's sewing basket traveled with her, and she'd teach volunteers to stitch stories into panels. Every place held a ribbon cutting, low-key, tender ceremonies echoing the original chapel speech, but carrying forward lives and fragments of fabric and lines of text. Months later, at an event in Boston, Emily stood beneath a completed mosaic, a wall of squares, each bearing a scrap and a word. A mother had added a swatch from her late daughter's dress with a note, "Gone but never forgotten." A young cancer survivor pinned a piece along with, "Stronger than I thought." A ticket seller from a nearby museum added a swatch from a thank you note. Emily understood then. The dress she had made and the silence she held had opened a door for others to speak. That evening, As Emily and Nathan walked hand in hand through the hospital corridors, staff stopped them, some to say hello, others to point out a story they hadn't known. No one mentioned the original dress anymore. It didn't matter. What mattered was what followed. Lives connected, voices heard, memories honored. That simple, off-the-rack wedding dress had become the seed of something much larger than either of them had ever imagined. The dress itself remained stored in Emily's closet, carefully folded. But its story lived, not just in a chapel, not just in a hospital lobby, but in a network of hearts stitched together with fabric and stories. And everywhere it reached, it reminded people, true beauty is not what you wear, it's what you carry.